Hey everyone, and welcome back to Motivation Library. You know we love a good biography here, and today we're diving deep into one that's really captured our attention.
Oh, absolutely. This one is incredible.
The Showman, Volodymyr Zelensky and the War in Ukraine by Simon Shuster. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Another book about the war in Ukraine.
Right, but trust me, this one's different.
It is. It's not your typical war story, just battles and all that.
Yeah, it's so much more personal.
So much more. It really traces Zelensky's journey, his whole path, from comedian to wartime leader.
And I think that's what makes it so fascinating, to see how someone with such an unconventional background rises to meet such an incredible challenge.
I'm Steve Cole.
And I'm Sophia Blake.
And we're ready to dive into this one. What really struck me about The Showman is the author's perspective. Simon Shuster has been reporting in Kiev since, get this, 2009.
Wow, so he really saw the city transform over time.
He did. He was there through all the ups and downs, the political turmoil, the revolution in 2014. He really witnessed it all. And his family history adds another layer to this, too. His father actually grew up in central Ukraine, not too far from where Zelensky's from.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty close connection.
It is. And then his mother, she's from Russia, a suburb of Moscow. So he's got family on both sides of this conflict.
That must give him such a unique understanding of the events and the people involved.
You can feel it in his writing. It's not just reporting. It's like he's lived through it. And speaking of unique, I have to share this little tidbit.
Right.
Did you know Zelensky actually disliked living in the presidential residence? He compared it to a hotel.
Really? That's hilarious. Not exactly the glamorous image we usually have of these places.
Right. So throughout this deep dive, we're going to uncover those little-known details and explore how Zelensky's past, especially his comedic background, really shaped him as a leader in the face of, well, unimaginable challenges.
We'll definitely be getting into that. And the book does a great job of taking us back to Zelensky's early life in Kryvyi Rih. It's a tough industrial city in southeastern Ukraine.
Not exactly a comedic hotbed, is it?
No, not at all. It was a rough-and-tumble place, known more for its steel plants than its stand-up clubs. But you know what they say, right?
What's that?
Adversity breeds creativity. And Zelensky actually credits that environment, that kind of grit, for shaping his comedic sensibilities.
Interesting. It's like he found humor as a way to cope with the harsh realities around him.
Exactly. He wasn't afraid to poke fun at the absurdity of life, even in a place as tough as Kryvyi Rih. And that kind of fearlessness, that willingness to challenge the status quo, would stay with him throughout his career.
And eventually lead him to the KVN Comedy League, right?
Right. That was huge in the former Soviet Union, like a cultural phenomenon.
I've heard of it, but I don't know much about it.
Yeah.
Was it like a TV show?
Yeah.
A competition?
Kind of both, actually. Teams from different cities and universities would compete against each other in these improv comedy battles. It was fast-paced, witty, and incredibly popular.
And Zelensky was a star in that league, right?
He was. He was part of this team called Kvartal 95, and they were known for their sharp humor and their ability to push boundaries. But here's the thing. The KVN League was based in Moscow.
So he was an outsider trying to make it in the big city. I can't imagine that was easy.
You're right. Shuster points out how Zelensky faced this, subtle discrimination. He was the guy from the provinces, the non-Moscovite.
And this was during the 90s, right?
Yeah.
After the Soviet Union had collapsed. You'd think those old divisions wouldn't matter anymore.
You'd think so. But those resentments, that Russian chauvinism, it was still there, simmering beneath the surface. And it definitely made things harder for Zelensky.
So he had to be even funnier, even sharper, just to prove himself.
Exactly. He had to overcome that bias.
Yeah.
And he did. He and his team became incredibly successful.
They didn't just win the KVN League, did they? They went on to create Studio Kvartal 95, right?
Yes, their own production company. And it became a massive success in Ukraine.
I remember hearing about their shows. Weren't they producing, everything from sitcoms to reality TV?
Pretty much. They had this wide range, all sorts of popular shows. And they weren't afraid to tackle sensitive topics either.
Like that incident with the car bombing?
Oh, yeah.
That was pretty wild.
Huh.
I mean, who gets their car firebombed for telling a joke?
It was after Zelensky made a joke about Ramzan Kadyrov, the Chechen leader, on a TV show. Kadyrov, who's well known for his brutality, didn't take it well.
You think?
Yeah.
So even in the world of comedy, Zelensky was pushing boundaries. He wasn't afraid to take risks, even if it meant putting himself in danger.
It's a pattern you see throughout his life, this willingness to stand up for what he believes in, even when it's risky.
And that brings us to a pivotal moment in both Zelensky's life and in Ukraine's history,
Mm.
the 2014 Ukrainian Revolution.
Oh, absolutely. That was a defining moment for the country and for Zelensky personally.
He was caught in this really difficult position. On the one hand, he was personally supportive of the protests. He believed in Ukraine's right to choose its own path.
But on the other hand, he had built this successful business, Studio Kvartal 95, and a lot of their revenue came from Russia.
So speaking out against Russia, or even appearing too sympathetic to the protesters, could have jeopardized everything he had worked for.
Exactly. It was a real dilemma. And it's interesting to see how he navigated that situation. He didn't stay completely silent, but he also didn't become a vocal activist.
He was trying to walk this fine line to support his country without alienating his Russian audience. It must have been incredibly difficult.
It was, and it gives you a glimpse into the complexities of the relationship between Ukraine and Russia, how deeply intertwined they were, even as those tensions were building.
And then out of all this turmoil comes a TV show that would change everything. Servant of the People. I mean, how wild is that? He plays a fictional president on TV, and then, bam, he becomes one in real life.
It almost seems too perfect, right? Like something out of a movie.
It does. And the show wasn't just some silly sitcom, was it?
No, it was actually pretty brilliant. It was this sharp satire of Ukrainian politics. Zelensky played this history teacher, this ordinary guy who gets thrust into the presidency after a video of him ranting about corruption goes viral.
So it was funny, but it was also making a serious point about the state of Ukrainian politics.
Exactly. It tapped into this deep frustration that people felt with the corruption, with the oligarchs, with the political elite who seemed more interested in enriching themselves than serving the people.
And Zelensky, with his everyman persona, was the perfect vehicle for that message.
He was. He represented this hope for something different, something better, and it resonated with people in a way that no traditional politician could.
So when he announced his candidacy for president in 2019, it wasn't just a publicity stunt.
No, it was the culmination of everything he had been building towards. He was ready to take that leap from fiction to reality.
But even though he had this huge platform, thanks to the show, his campaign was anything bitchy conventional. He didn't go the traditional route, those big rallies, the backroom deals.
He did almost everything online, using social media to connect directly with voters. He was like, I'm bypassing the old system. I'm going straight to the people.
And it worked. Big time. He won in a landslide.
Mm-hmm.
It was this stunning upset, this rejection of the old political establishment.
It really was, and you could see the shock on people's faces, the sense of, wait, did this really just happen?
I bet. And for Zelensky and his team, it must have been this whirlwind of emotions. On the one hand, exhilaration. Right, you just achieved this incredible victory.
But on the other hand, terror. Like, oh my God, we actually have to do this now. We have to govern.
And govern a country that's facing some pretty serious challenges, not to mention a looming threat from Russia. Talk about a baptism by fire.
It was. And that's where things get really interesting, because suddenly this comedian, this guy who had never held political office before, is thrust onto the world stage with the weight of a nation on his shoulders.
Okay, so he's president, but he's still got that comedian image. I can only imagine what those first few months in office were like.
Well, according to the book, it was a steep learning curve. He was grappling with how to transform himself from this popular entertainer into a statesman, a world leader.
That couldn't have been easy. People are probably expecting him to crack jokes during diplomatic meetings.
Right, and he had to prove that he could be serious, that he could handle the complexities of international relations, and at the same time, he was dealing with the realities of Ukrainian politics.
Which is a whole other beast, right?
Oh, absolutely. You've got this entrenched corruption, a bureaucracy that moves at a glacial pace, and the constant threat of interference from Russia. It was incredibly frustrating for him. He wanted to move quickly to implement reforms, but the system was resistant to change.
And all this while trying to maintain some semblance of peace in eastern Ukraine, where those pro-Russian separatists were still active.
Exactly. He made these attempts to engage with the people living in those separatist-controlled areas of Donbass. He wanted to understand their grievances, to find common ground. But it was a risky move.
Because it made him look weak in the eyes of some Ukrainians.
Yeah.
Like he was giving in to the separatists.
Exactly. He was walking this tightrope, trying to find a peaceful solution while also standing up for Ukraine's sovereignty. And then, just when things couldn't seem to get any more complicated, the whole Trump scandal explodes.
Oh, yeah, that was a mess.
It really was. Suddenly, Zelensky, this new president still finding his footing, is thrust into the center of this geopolitical firestorm.
with the fate of his country hanging in the balance.
And remember, this is all happening while those Russian troops are building up on Ukraine's borders.
Yeah, talk about a ticking time bomb. You can feel the tension rising as you read this part of the book.
Oh, absolute. You know, like that feeling when you know something bad's about to happen, but you're not sure exactly what or when.
Right, and Zelensky's trying to downplay it, right? He's telling everyone to stay calm, even launching that Keep Calm and Visit Ukraine campaign.
It seems almost surreal now looking back. Like, how could they not see what was coming?
Well, it's complicated. You've got the U.S. intelligence community saying an invasion is imminent, but then you've got the Ukrainian government. They're trying to project stability to avoid panic. They didn't want to spook investors or provoke Russia even further.
It's a tough spot to be in, right? Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
And let's be honest, a lot of people, even in the West, were skeptical. They thought Putin was just bluffing, that he was just trying to intimidate Ukraine.
Right. It seemed unthinkable that a full-scale invasion of a European country could happen in the 21st century. But it did.
On February 24th, 2022, that line vanished. It was no longer a question of RF, but when. And when those first explosions rocked Kiev, it's like the whole world held its breath. What really struck me in the book was the way Shuster describes those first hours of the invasion. It's chaos, pure chaos. You can almost hear the sirens, feel the ground shaking.
And Zelensky's in the middle of it all, right? Faced with this impossible decision. Does he flee like so many world leaders would have done, or does he stay and fight?
I mean, it's easy for us to say, oh, he did the right thing, but in that moment, with bombs raining down, I can't imagine the pressure he must have felt.
And remember, he's got a wife and kids. His family is in danger, too.
It's a decision that could have gone either way. But what's incredible is that Zelensky didn't even hesitate.
He chose to stay.
He chose to stay and fight alongside his people. And that decision right there was the turning point. It's what cemented his legacy, what transformed him in the eyes of the world.
From a comedian, a politician, into a wartime leader.
I get chills just thinking about that video he posted right after the invasion started. He's standing there with his team, looking straight into the camera, saying, "The president is here." It was simple, powerful, and it went viral.
It was a masterclass in using social media to project strength and leadership during a crisis. And he didn't stop there. He kept those messages coming, those defiant speeches, those videos that captured the world's attention.
He became the voice of Ukraine, rallying his people, shaming world leaders into action, and garnering international support.
And the book doesn't just focus on those big moments, those grand gestures. It also reveals these glimpses of vulnerability, those quieter moments that show the human side of Zelensky.
Like that phone call with his parents.
Oh, yeah, that part broke my heart. They're elderly, living right in the path of the Russian advance, and he's trying to reassure them, saying something like, "Mom, you're the president's mother. Nothing can happen to you." It's just so human, so relatable. He's not just this fearless leader. He's a son worried about his parents.
It's a reminder that behind those public pronouncements, those tough decisions, there are real people, real emotions involved. And in those early days, he had to make some incredibly tough decisions. Declaring martial law, mobilizing the country, asking citizens to take up arms and fight.
Decisions that no leader should ever have to make, especially one with no military background.
It's a heavy burden to carry, knowing that your choices are going to send people to their deaths.
And the book also sheds light on those in Zelensky's inner circle, the people who were right there with him during those dark early days of the war.
Like Ruslan Stefanchuk, the Speaker of Parliament. I can't even imagine the pressure he was under, knowing he was next in line for the presidency if something happened to Zelensky.
It must have been surreal.
And then there's Andrei Yermak, Zelensky's close friend and advisor. He went from producing gangster movies to suddenly coordinating with generals and world leaders.
Yeah.
Talk about a crash course in international relations.
It's amazing how quickly they all had to adapt to rise to the occasion.
And in those early days, weeks, even months, Zelensky wasn't just leading Ukraine, he was becoming this global symbol of resistance, this embodiment of the fight for freedom against tyranny. He wasn't a military strategist, but he had something else, this charisma, this ability to connect with people, not just in Ukraine, but around the world.
And he wasn't afraid to use that charisma, that power of communication, to shame world leaders into action, to rally support for Ukraine.
He was constantly putting out those messages, those speeches, those videos that were both defiant and deeply human. He became this master storyteller, shaping the narrative of the war and putting a human face on the Ukrainian struggle.
And it wasn't just words. He was also out there visiting wounded soldiers, meeting with troops on the front lines, seeing firsthand the devastation caused by the Russian invasion.
It was a risky move, but it showed his commitment, his willingness to share in the dangers faced by his people.
Remember that story in the book about his visit to those soldiers stationed near a bridge that had been blown up to stop the Russian advance? It was right after the invasion, explosions are going off in the distance, and Zelensky goes right up to them and asks, "What do you need?"
And what did they say?
"All we want is victory." It's chilling, isn't it?
It really is, and it shows the kind of determination, the spirit of resistance that Zelensky was tapping into.
As the initial shock of the invasion wore off, though, and the war dragged on, Zelensky had to transition from this symbol of defiance into a more hands-on leader. It wasn't enough to just rally the troops. He had to grapple with complex military strategies, manage the war effort, and coordinate with allies who were providing crucial support.
And that's where his relationship with General Valery Zelensky, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, becomes even more important.
Right, you've got Zelensky, who's still learning the ropes of wartime leadership, and Zelensky, the seasoned, battle-hardened general. They had to find a way to work together to bridge the gap between politics and military strategy.
And it sounds like it wasn't always easy, was it?
It wasn't. The book describes some real tension between them. Zelensky, feeling the weight of every casualty, every lost city, started getting more involved in military decisions, which ruffled some feathers.
I can see how that would cause friction. You've got a president who's never worn a uniform trying to tell a four-star general how to fight a war.
Exactly. Some people saw it as Zelensky overstepping his bounds, interfering in areas where he lacked expertise. But others argue he was simply doing what he had to do, taking charge in a crisis.
And to be fair, he had learned a lot by that point. He'd been immersed in the war for months, meeting with generals, talking to world leaders, absorbing information like a sponge.
And he was under immense pressure. He was responsible for the lives of millions of people, and the fate of his nation was hanging in the balance.
It's easy to criticize from the sidelines, but he was the one making those tough calls, with limited information and a lot of unknowns. So even if there were disagreements, it sounds like he and Zelensky were still able to function as a team.
They were, and their partnership was crucial to Ukraine's early successes in the war. Zelensky continued to do what he did best, rallying international support, securing weapons and funding, keeping Ukraine's story in the spotlight. Meanwhile, Zelensky focused on the battlefield, orchestrating those stunning counteroffensives that surprised everyone, including the Russians.
Like the liberation of Kharkiv. That was a major turning point, wasn't it?
It was. It showed that Ukraine could not only defend itself, but could actually go on the offensive and win.
And it was a brilliant strategic move by Zelensky. The Russians were completely caught off guard.
And Zelensky, of course, was right there in the aftermath, visiting Kharkiv, meeting with residents, thanking the soldiers, showing the world that Ukraine was still fighting, still winning.
And he wasn't just relying on military force. He was also using his communication skills to maintain the pressure on Russia from a global perspective.
Oh, absolutely. Remember that powerful address he gave to the U.S. Congress?
The one where he invoked Pearl Harbor and 9/11?
That's the one. It was incredibly moving. He knew how to connect with his audience, to make them feel the urgency of the situation.
And it worked. That speech, along with countless others, helped secure billions of dollars in aid and crucial weapons systems, like the HIMARS rocket launchers.
Those HIMARS were game changers. They gave Ukraine the ability to strike deep behind enemy lines, disrupting Russian supply chains and command centers. They were a key factor in those later Ukrainian counteroffensives.
But it wasn't all victories, was it?
No, there were also setbacks, heartbreaking losses. The siege of Mariupol was a tragedy. Those soldiers trapped in that steel plant fighting to the last man. It's hard to imagine what those soldiers went through and what Zelensky must have felt, knowing there was little he could do to help them.
It must have been incredibly difficult for him to balance those hopes for peace with the grim reality of war, those calls for negotiations, with the knowledge that any concession could be seen as a betrayal by his people.
It really does make you question, how much can one person endure? How do you make those kinds of decisions when the stakes are so high?
And the pressure from the international community must have been intense, too. Those calls for a negotiated settlement, for Zelensky to give up territory in exchange for peace.
Right. There was this growing sense of, okay, the initial shock has worn off. The war's been going on for months now. How do we bring this to an end?
But as we've seen throughout Zelensky's journey, he's not one to back down easily.
Absolutely not, especially when he believes he's on the right side of history. And that's what makes this part of the book so fascinating. You see Zelensky wrestling with these competing pressures, the desire for peace versus the need to stand up to aggression, to defend Ukraine's sovereignty.
And you can understand where those calling for peace were coming from. It's easy to say, never give in, when you're not the one facing those bombs, those casualties.
Right, it's a different story when it's your country, your people, your cities being destroyed.
But Zelensky seemed to understand on a gut level that giving in to Putin's demands would only embolden him. It's like rewarding bad behavior, right?
Exactly. It would set a dangerous precedent, sending the message that it's okay to invade a sovereign nation and just take what you want.
And it would be a betrayal of all those Ukrainians who had fought and died defending their country.
Exactly. So how do you balance those competing pressures, those calls for peace, with the need to keep fighting?
Well, it's a tightrope walk, isn't it?
It is, and that's where Zelensky's leadership had to evolve even further. He couldn't just be the rallying figure, the symbol of resistance anymore.
He had to become a wartime commander-in-chief, making tough decisions about strategy, about resources, about where to focus Ukraine's efforts.
And those decisions often put him at odds with his own military leaders.
Especially General Zelensky, right? Their relationship had been so crucial in those early months of the war, but as the conflict dragged on, things got a bit more, let's say, complicated.
There were definitely some clashes. Zelensky, feeling the weight of every casualty, every lost city, started getting more involved in military planning, even questioning some of Zelensky's decisions.
Which probably didn't go over too well.
Not always. Zelensky, remember, is this seasoned general. He's not used to having a civilian, even a president, second-guessing his battlefield tactics.
So it created some tension, but it also forced them both to think more strategically, to be more open to different perspectives.
And ultimately, they found a way to make it work. It was a partnership built on mutual respect, even if they didn't always agree.
It's almost like this push and pull between them, this creative tension, ended up benefiting Ukraine in the long run.
I think so. Zelensky continued to do what he did best, rallying international support, securing those crucial weapons shipments, keeping Ukraine's story in the headlines. And Zelensky focused on the military side, planning those counteroffensives that would eventually turn the tide of the war.
Speaking of which, we have to talk about the liberation of Kharkiv.
Oh, absolutely. That was a major turning point, a real morale booster for Ukraine.
And it showcased Zelensky's brilliance as a military strategist. The Russians had no idea what hit them.
They were expecting this slow, grinding battle for the Donbas region, but instead, the Ukrainians launched this lightning-fast offensive in the northeast, catching everyone by surprise.
And Zelensky, as always, was right there in the aftermath, visiting the liberated city, meeting with residents, thanking the soldiers. He knew the power of those images, how they could galvanize support both at home and abroad.
And he didn't just rely on military victories to sway public opinion. He also leveraged those incredible communication skills of his. Remember that address to the U.S. Congress, the one where he invoked Pearl Harbor and 9/11?
Oh yeah, that was powerful stuff. He really knows how to tailor his message to different audiences, how to evoke those emotional connections.
And it worked. That speech, along with countless others, helped secure those billions of dollars in aid and those crucial weapon systems that Ukraine so desperately needed, like the HIMARS rocket launchers.
Those HIMARS were a game changer, weren't they?
They were. They gave Ukraine the ability to hit those Russian supply lines, those command centers, deep behind enemy lines. It was a huge shift in the balance of power.
But it wasn't all victories, was it? There were still those heartbreaking losses, like the siege of Mariupol.
Oh, yeah, that was just devastating. Those soldiers, those Azov fighters trapped in that steel plant, surrounded, outgunned, but refusing to surrender. It was a story of incredible courage and resilience, but also of immense tragedy.
It must have been agonizing for Zelensky to watch that unfold, knowing there was little he could do to save them. It's a reminder that even the most inspiring leaders can't control everything, that war is ultimately a brutal, unpredictable force.
It is, and that's what makes The Showman such a compelling read. It doesn't shy away from the complexities of war, the moral dilemmas, the personal sacrifices. It shows that Zelensky not as this larger-than-life hero, but as a human being, flawed, vulnerable, but ultimately determined to do what's right for his country and his people.
And it really challenges our preconceived notions of what a leader looks like, where they come from, what qualities they need to possess.
Right. Zelensky had no military experience, no political background to speak of. He was a comedian, for goodness sake. But he stepped up when his country needed him most, and he's shown the world what true leadership is all about. Courage, resilience, empathy, and a willingness to fight for what you believe in.
And that's something we can all learn from, whether we're leading a nation or just trying to navigate our own lives.
Yeah.
The Showman is more than just a war story. It's a story about the power of the human spirit, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the enduring belief in the possibility of a better future.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope, and that even the most unlikely of heroes can rise to meet the challenge.
If you haven't read it yet, we highly recommend checking it out. The Showman, Volodymyr Zelensky, and the War in Ukraine by Simon Shuster.
It's an incredible read, and as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What stood out to you about Zelensky's leadership? What are your takeaways from the story? Share your reactions with us on social media using #MotivationLibrary.
And thanks for joining us here at Motivation Library for another deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and never stop being curious about the world around you.